My name is Victoria Robinson, and I will be doing a presentation on addiction, a biological and learned response. The discussion question that I chose was to explain the connection for addiction being a biological or a learned response. My response was that addiction can be both a learned response and a biological response. In my paper, I referred to two peer-reviewed articles. The first article is Addiction Motivation Reformulated, an effective processing model of negative reinforcement. The second article is Clinical Neuroscience of Addiction, Applications to Psychological Science and Practice. So the first study provided a reformulated model of negative reinforcement that frames addiction as a learned response. And the second study refers to existing evidence that supports the view of addiction being a brain disease, thus being a biological response. So in my paper, I first addressed addiction as a learned response. In the first article, the researchers asserted that negative reinforcement is the principal motivation for drug use. So the researchers characterized drug use and withdrawal by explaining that after a single use or multiple uses, that falling drug levels in the body can trigger what they refer to as an aversive effect or withdrawal. So that would lead a person to use more drugs to avoid experiencing that aversive effect of withdrawal symptoms. The researchers explained that withdrawal can be prompted by associative processes. So for instance, the increase in a drug user's urges were commonly associated with the aversive withdrawal symptoms. So this is important because withdrawal symptoms often begin in the early stages of drug use and they intensify as the addiction progresses. So because withdrawal is present during the beginning of drug use, an addicted individual will learn to detect interoceptive cues when drug levels in the body begin to fall. So interoceptive cues detect withdrawal symptoms and negative affect. And so this is important because negative affect has a significant impact on motivating addicted individuals to use drugs. So the researchers cited animal research which found that animals learn to detect interoceptive cues and respond to negative affect. This is significant because these animals were not consciously aware of these signals. And so the same pattern of behavior can be exhibited in humans in that the detection of these nascent internal cues are often pre-conscious, meaning that before they become consciously aware, they are already responding to these interoceptive cues. So the researchers cited signal avoidance learning as a principal motivator for addictive behavior because nascent withdrawal symptoms or interoceptive cues associated with them can often act as signals. So in signal avoidance learning, an organism is presented with a signal conditioned stimulus followed by an aversive unconditioned stimulus. During addiction, cues of falling drug levels might serve as a conditioned stimulus, and the unconditioned stimulus would be the negative affect, and the avoidance response would be the drug intake. So what this means is that when drug levels are falling in the body, it starts to trigger those withdrawal symptoms, thus prompting an addicted individual to want to consume more drugs. And so the avoidance response is difficult to extinguish, and it is also easily susceptible to being reestablished. For addiction as a biological response, the second article looked at preclinical research on the neural circuitry of alcohol and drug use and found that alcohol and drug abuse trigger the same neural processes that trigger common responses to natural rewards like food and sex. The release of dopamine in the brain triggers a potent high in an individual, but the natural reward pathway is more potent than that of drug abuse. What makes this reward pathway more potent to an addict is neural adaptation, which means that an individual is more susceptible to the drug and its reinforcing effect, thus contributing to the overall disease of addiction. So alcohol and drug use have a conditioning effect on the brain, wherein the brain seeks these types of reinforcers in exchange of natural rewards, which becomes less potent and salient to the addicted individual over time, meaning that the more that they consume or use drugs, the less of the effect of the natural rewards become to them. So drug intake becomes less about experiencing the temporary rewarding effect and more about fulfilling what has become become a biological need. So it's similar to extreme hunger or thirst. Though alcohol or drug use is initially a voluntary behavior, it becomes a biological response as the substance hijacks the brain's reward circuitry to continue the addicted individual's use of the substance. So this hijacking is what makes addiction a disease, because at that point, the behavior is no longer voluntary, but it's a maladaptive response to the brain essentially being hijacked. So basic neuroscience of addiction proposes that reward is divided into liking and wanting the drug. So the brain's opioid system is suggested to be responsible for drug liking, whereas the dopamine pathways are attributed to wanting the drug, or what's called drug cravings. So this explains why addicted individuals reported that their addictions were less about experiencing the high and more about preventing the effects of withdrawal. And so the researchers cited the opponent process theory to further explain why the addiction is less about experiencing the high. So the opponent process theory explains how the simultaneous occurrence of two opposing processes both affect motivation. In terms of addiction, the theory explains that the A process, or positive reinforcement, is of a lesser concern than the B process, or negative reinforcement, because experiencing the high is no longer enjoyable since withdrawal is more powerful than the experience of enjoying the high. So in conclusion, addiction can be a learned response as well as a biological response. The first article showed that addiction can be a learned response through signaled avoidance learning, and the second article showed that addiction can be a biological response due to the substance taking control of the brain's reward circuitry. These are my references, and thank you for listening.